Hi there, I'm reporter Amy Lee Womack of the Telegraph. This Sunday we had a story about the Heaven Woods murder case, and we'll be taking your questions. I'll be talking a little bit about what it was like to report the case. So I hope you'll spend a few minutes with us.
Okay, we have a couple questions for Amy Lee to get her kicked off, and you guys can always leave your questions in the comments section below and she'll answer them. So this weekend, you published a big story about the death of 5-year-old Heaven Woods. First, tell us a little about who Heaven was and what happened to her.
Heaven was a 5-year-old little girl, and she was living with her mother in the Rome area. They'd moved around a lot in the Atlanta and even up to West Virginia in that general vicinity, coming back to Atlanta, Rome, that area. Well, it turns out that they ended up moving to Forsyth about 3 weeks before Heaven died, and they were living with her mother's boyfriend. So on, I think it was May 20th of 14, the emergency services got a 911 call that there was a child that was unresponsive at the house. And when they arrived, they found that Heaven was there, and an autopsy later found that the little girl had literally been beaten to death. After looking through the files in the case, it became very clear that this child was abused, not just right that time when she was killed, but there was a history of abuse that somehow she had stayed in the home, and she'd gone through this for a good bit of her little 5 years.
So tell us how you went about reporting the story.
So the way that works is when a criminal case is still pending, then there's very little information that is released. Reporters can ask all the questions we want, but generally the authorities don't say much. But in this case, the boyfriend, Roderick Buckner, he pled guilty to murder last year. And then her mother, Amanda Hendrickson, she pled guilty about a month ago. After that happened, the case was considered closed, and under open records law, we could request all of the case records. So I requested them, read through them, watched the videos and the interviews, and then I talked with Defects because obviously this is a case that's clear that Defects was involved and something didn't happen that was supposed to. And I talked with Heaven's father just about what it must have been like to have had a daughter that died this awful death, and found out that he had been working for years to try to get her out of that home and get custody of her.
So you're going through these files, and how long did that take you?
I wish that I had a lot more time than I had to work with it. I actually made it through it in about 2 days. It was about this thick if you printed everything out that I printed out, and then there were at least a few hours of videos and audio to listen to. But it took about 2 days to get through to have a good handle on what you had there.
And what did your reporting find as you're going through all this?
What I found is that Defects was called numerous times. Reports from different people, whether it was from Heaven's father, whether it was from family friends, or even just people related to her daycare, with people who were concerned, and they were calling the authorities like you're told to do, and somehow the system didn't catch these things. Like with her autopsy, it was found that she had multiple broken ribs, and it wasn't just from doing the chest compressions trying to revive her. It wasn't from the injuries that she sustained right before she died, the days before she was died and she was beaten. It showed that this little girl had these injuries that were in different stages of healing, showing that they had been inflicted over time. So those are the most troubling things, I think, that showed in the reports.
And so how does that happen? How does it get to this point when people have called Defects?
Well, that's the thing that I don't think that we'll ever know. I mean, when I talked to Defects, they told me they made a number of changes since this case, some of them specifically because of the case. One of them, and it really struck me as odd, and probably other people as well, is that before this case, when you called Defects, when they launched an investigation, they didn't necessarily talk with the person who made the first report. Now it's policy that they have to. They have to talk with that person who may very well be the person with really helpful information to help them kick the case off. Another thing that they mentioned to me was that with the recession, like so many other people that lost their jobs, lost staffing, Defects was really knocked down in staffing, and they've just only now come back to anywhere near where they were before the recession. So they were short-staffed when this would have been happening with all those complaints. Another thing was that there was this phone bank where a woman called on the day that she saw Heaven being beaten out in the family's front yard. And she said that she tried to stay on the line, waiting on somebody to answer. She called twice, and between the two of them, she thinks that she was probably on the phone for 30 minutes. And now the hold time is about 30 seconds, if that. So they've made changes to that. So it's clear that something needed to be fixed and that the state is trying to move in the right direction. It's just that only time can tell whether what they're doing is going to be enough.
So tell us more about the neighbor. I know we have on Macon.com some of the police interview. Tell us about what her interview with the police was.
Okay, what she said was that she was living next door to this family, and she just happened to see outside that Heaven and her mother and the boyfriend were out there on 2 different occasions. And she saw 2 different days, more or less the same thing happen. The boyfriend was playing around with Heaven, apparently, so he says, but what the neighbor saw was that he put his elbow into her stomach and then kneed her also in the stomach. And on one of those occasions, it had something to do with her soiling her pants, being a 5-year-old. So they were getting very upset at her for that. But what she told the police was on 2 days, I think it was a Sunday and a Monday, that she saw this man put his elbow and his knee into this little girl who, I mean, she was little. She weighed less than 50 pounds, and that caused major abdominal injuries, and the autopsy showed that she died of massive internal bleeding that would have been caused by that kind of an injury.
So, and I just want to, for the people who, have just joined us and are with us now, just want to let you know you can comment at the bottom of the video if you have any questions for Amy Lee. We're talking about the Heaven Woods case, a 5-year-old girl who was killed basically from child abuse. And I know, Amy Lee, that you interviewed her dad. Tell us about that.
Anthony Woods, he told me that he fought a good bit, even up until right before Heaven died, trying to get custody of her. He moved from West Virginia to Georgia after hearing that Heaven had bruises on her. He was very concerned about his daughter's welfare, and he was doing everything he could to try to help her, from what he told me. He has a case that's pending against the state now, actually, just trying to save other children, trying to change policies to make things better. He couldn't save his little girl, unfortunately, but he wants to make things better for other children.
And so at one time, the death penalty was on the table for the mother and her boyfriend. What happened with that?
Okay, so prosecutors initially sought the death penalty against both of them because they felt like she had been tortured. And under the law, you have to have a certain criteria has to be met for you to seek the death penalty. You can't seek the death penalty for just any case. But this one they thought was that bad that they wanted to seek it. Well, what it comes out is, from what I understand, the lead GBI agent on the case himself was arrested for some child abuse, for child molestation. And that was one of the things that went into their thinking when they decided, hey, maybe this doesn't necessarily need to go to trial. Mr. Buckner did accept a plea bargain, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So he's never going to see the light of day. And then the mother, Amanda Hendrickson, she pled guilty to murder, and she was sentenced to life. So that means that she won't be eligible for consideration for parole until she's been in prison for 30 years. That doesn't mean that she'll be paroled at that time, but that says that that's when the parole board will first look at her case.
Did either of them ever express regret or remorse?
I did not hear that. If it did happen, I didn't read that. I didn't see it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I did not see that, no.
And so do you think could heaven have been saved? The title of the piece on Sunday was "Did Heaven Have to Die?" Did heaven have to die?
Well, from what I understand, if the case had gone to trial, a doctor would have testified that if Heaven had been taken to the hospital after she was injured with those injuries to her abdomen, then she might have been able to have been saved. But as what happened, she laid there and literally bled to death. The other thing is, if Defects had intervened earlier, who's to say what might have happened? And going back to the previous question about whether anybody expressed remorse, thinking back, I do believe that Mr. Buckner may have expressed some remorse at his plea hearing. Not 100% sure on that, but he may have at that time.
And we want to thank Annette Smith for the comment. Says, "This is very sad. Again, another child lost because of our system not being there for her poor baby." Did anything surprise you personally as you were reporting the story?
It was just amazing to me that you had so many people who were around this child and had concerns about her, and it just seemed like nothing ever changed. I mean, you're in a situation where before they even moved to Forsyth, multiple people were making these reports to Defects. Even there was one report just weeks before Heaven died, I believe it was 3 weeks before, where someone right around the school where Heaven was going to school in the Rome area said that her mother had kicked her in the back, and Defects launched a case. Well, they had 3 weeks. Yes, the family moved, but I mean, you would assume that people might be able to track them down in some way or another if there was a serious concern that this child might be being harmed, especially when you already had several other cases. Just in this house where Heaven lived for the last few weeks of her life, in the case file, it showed that Mr. Buckner's mother and his sister also lived there, and they heard the sounds of Heaven being beaten. And in the days before Heaven died, Mr. Buckner admitted that his mother had called him while he was at work and said, "You need to tell this woman to stop beating Heaven. You need to stop it." There were so many people that were aware of the problem, and this little girl still ended up dying.
Sydney Nix asks, was she an organ donor?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Look, Queena Jackson just says, "Rest in heaven, sweet angel. I hope this is a wake-up call for our system." Deborah Huggins also chiming in, "Defects failed this child. Their failure caused her death." Is there anything else that you think people should know about this case?
I think another thing that says something to me about this case is that this mother, she'd already had 3 children before she had Heaven. She didn't have custody of any of those children at the time that Heaven died. She had another child after she was in jail for Heaven's death. That child was put up for adoption. I think that it's just interesting that the system works in such a way that, that can happen. That, these children are victims, even the ones that didn't die. I mean, sure, they might live to have great lives, but at the same time, they were impacted by this woman as well. Maybe they were saved in a way that Heaven was not. Another thing that struck me was that it came out that the mother had sent a message to Mr. Buckner while he was at work one of the days before Heaven died, and actually said, "You need to come home because I've been beating Heaven all day." And that's a temperament that I just don't understand. I think many of us who are parents out there, it's very hard for us to understand. Those are some of the things that really struck me as interesting.
You talked a little bit about changes that have been made at Defects. Did they seem hopeful that, that would, of course, unfortunately to say, you're not going to catch everything, and some things will fall through the cracks. But did it seem like this was going to make a difference in what they were trying to do?
I think that they're hopeful that things will get better from this point, but I think that they're realistic and they understand that this is an ongoing system, and I think that they know that there's more that needs to be done. I mean, the case managers, it sounds like they're still trying to make it where they have fewer cases so they can put more attention onto each individual child and each individual case. Another of the things that they mentioned was the fact that before Heaven's death, when there was a report of physical abuse, it didn't necessarily go straight to an investigation. And now that's something that does happen. You're not just rooted to family resources. How can we help support you through parenting classes or community resources, some variety? Now it's a full-out investigation within 24 hours. They're going to check on the child, lay eyes on the child, make sure that child is okay. So I think that they're trying. Is anything ever perfect? We all wish it was.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about this story. When this chat's over, I'm going to post the link to the story in the comments in case you haven't had a chance to read it. We highly recommend it. And if you have anything else you want to add in the comments later, still feel free to do so. If you like this, let us know. If you didn't, let us know. But hopefully we'll be doing more of these and you can join us again next time. Thank you.
Thank you.